This light tends to spaz out for some reason, so no alarm.
Exactly.
Stop doing that.
A little wear and tear, but that's okay. And you received this one? Nope, we will not do that. Hi. Thank you for coming.
Just one.
The total for anyone is 35.97. You want a receipt?
No, thank you.
Okay, you're all set.
All right, thanks.
Enjoy. Sure. You never know.
Okay, everybody, we're going to go ahead and start. My name is Jackie Berry. I'm the adult specialist here at the Schlafly Branch Library. I want to thank you so much for joining us and welcome back. If this is your first program in person again. I'm very guilty. Please silence your phones if you have not already, so we don't interrupt anyone. I'm going to leave the doors open because sometimes people say that it starts to get stuffy in here, so we'll leave it open until somebody complains that it's too loud. It'll be fun. I'm going to hand it over to Shane Mullen from Left Bank Books. Thank you so much.
All right, hello everyone. Hello. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is Left Bank Books, Millard, for River of the Gods. Tonight's event is possible because of your support. When you support Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into the local economy. It helps us keep our bookstore open. It also helps keep your streets paved, your libraries funded, your parks free, and so many other things, making St. Louis a better place. So I would like to thank you all for shopping local tonight and for supporting this event. We also want to welcome our virtual audience this evening. Hello. I do know that people are already watching, eager to see tonight's presentation, so I'll keep my introduction short. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis, including our very new Gabe. This is Gabe's first event as a Left Bank Books employee, second event because we did Gabe's book launch. I do want to point out that we are in the middle of our River City Readers fundraiser. The River City Readers is our nonprofit. It's part of our nonprofit that gets books into the hands of underserved St. Louis public school children. So if you are interested in adding a donation to your purchase this evening, or if you want to make a donation separate, we would love to accept your donation of any amount, and I thank you ahead of time for that. We are doing a lot more in-person events this summer. We will still be producing virtual events, so if anyone has been watching those, they will continue to be happening as we do hybrid events as well. So we will have our in-person events hybrid into the virtual world. Of note, on June 21st, we are hosting Dr. Ibram X. Kendi at the Grand Ole Theater. And that is a ticketed event featuring a special guest appearance by local illustrator Kibabi Beyak. We are also hosting at the end of the month National Book Award winning author Jason Mott for the paperback tour for his National Book Award winning book, Hell of a Book. And it is phenomenal. I loved that one. I'm going to let Candice tell you a lot about tonight's book, so I'm going to skip the description and just say that I have read this book. It is incredibly well researched. The way it all ties together in the end is just masterful. So if you have not yet read it, I strongly recommend that you do. If you aren't convinced by me, hopefully you'll be convinced by Candice. Candice Millard is the author of the New York Times bestsellers, The River of Doubt, Destiny of the Republic, and Hero of the Empire. She lives in Kansas City, Kansas, with her husband and 3 children. So now, on behalf of Left Bank Books and the Schlafly branch of the St. Louis Public Library, would you all please help me in warmly welcoming Candice Millard.
Thank you very much for coming tonight. It's always such a thrill and an honor to be working with Think Books and with the library. I'm obviously a huge fan of libraries, so thank you for coming. For more than 1,000 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, the leaders of the European world assumed that Greek and Roman culture represented the pinnacle of human achievement. They taught their children and priests and scientists to study Greek and Latin. They venerated Greek and Roman writing and art. And they even tried to recreate the glories of Athens and Rome. Then, at the end of the 1700s, the discovery of the Rosetta Stone unlocked the even older secrets of ancient Egypt, setting off a century-long political and scientific scramble to discover and claim the legacy of the pharaohs, and ultimately the continent of Africa. Of course, you can't have Egypt without the Nile, the longest and most storied river in the world, which made possible one of the oldest and richest continuous civilizations in history. Bringing life to the Egyptian desert on its more than 4,000-mile-long journey to the Mediterranean Sea. The question was, where did it begin? It was a tantalizing, maddening mystery that, for millennia, had captivated and frustrated everyone from ancient philosophers to Greek historians to Egyptian kings, each determined to find the river source, and with it, the presumed origin of human wisdom and learning. This book is the story of that epic quest, which forced its participants to overcome some of the most forbidding obstacles and hostile conditions in the history of Western exploration. It required traveling more than 1,000 miles into the heart of Africa, which Europeans had never penetrated or understood. It tested the limits even of the mighty British Empire with all of its growing power and resources. And it meant enduring terrifyingly strange, crippling diseases, near starvation, and attack from local peoples prepared to defend their land against uninvited, ultimately dangerous intruders. More than anything else, however, this is a story about the best and the worst of human beings. It's about the heights of human achievement, the enormous limitations of human understanding, and the familiar tragic costs of envy, betrayal, and personal ambition. In a very real sense, the entire idea of discovering a continent on which millions of people lived was an exercise in vanity and parochialism. Even more pronounced was the degree to which the search became dominated and identified with the individuals who led it, whose all too recognizable failings and conflicts would make it a lasting example of personal rivalry and ultimately personal loss. I won't tell you the whole story today, I'll leave that to the book, but let me draw the outlines of the people and places that made it irresistible to me. Let's begin in the hallowed halls of the Royal Geographical Society, one of Britain's most esteemed institutions. Can you switch to the next?
Yes.
Founded in 1830, the Royal Geographical Society quickly became the country's most powerful scientific society, counting among its members Britain's most venerated scientists and explorers, from Charles Darwin to David Livingstone. In the 1850s, determined to take the lead in the battle for the timeless treasures of Egypt and the land of Africa, Britain relied largely on the Royal Geographical Society. In turn, the society resolved to mount one of the most complex and demanding expeditions ever attempted. Rather than begin in the north and attempt to ascend the river, as so many had tried and failed to do over millennia, they would begin on the east coast of Africa, well below the equator, and proceed inland in search of the elusive source of the Nile. Next slide, please. It had long been known that the Nile was made up of two primary branches, the white and the blue. The white, which is named for the light gray silt that gives its waters a milky hue, is longer and joins the faster, darker blue Nile near Khartoum in Sudan. A Spanish Jesuit had found the source of the blue Nile, Lake Tana, in northern Ethiopia in 1618. But more than 200 years later, the source of the White Nile remained a mystery. In those 200 years, there was a great deal of discussion and debate about the White Nile, but very little progress, until 1855, when the Society received an exceedingly strange map of East Africa. Next slide. Drawn by two German missionary explorers, the map was notable for a single feature: an enormous inland sea that was so strangely shaped that even the most experienced geographers struggled to describe it. Eventually, it just became known as the slug map. But it caused an immediate stir among gentlemen scientists and armchair geographers, and it gave a sudden sense of urgency to finding the source of the White Nile. The Society quickly formed the East African expedition and began looking for the right man to lead it. Next one, please. Few men were as qualified to lead an expedition as Richard Francis Burton. Burton was already an incredibly accomplished explorer. He had been the first Englishman to enter Mecca disguised as a Muslim, a journey that few others had either the skill or the audacity to make. He spoke more than 25 different languages, everything from French and German to Hindustani, Armenian, Turkish, Swahili. And he was an extraordinarily gifted and prolific writer, writing dozens of books, essays, poetry, translations. But no matter what he accomplished, he was always considered an outsider in England, always looked upon with suspicion and distrust. He had been born in Devon to British parents, but he was raised in Europe, moving 13 times for his 18th birthday. France to Italy to Greece, effortlessly picking up languages and cultures along the way. He had also grown up fighting, from street brawls to school skirmishes to violent encounters with enraged tutors. In fact, the only childhood teacher Burton had respected was his fencing master, a former soldier who only had one thumb because he had lost the other in battle. The lessons paid off, eventually turning Burton into one of the most skilled swordsmen in Europe. He had attended Oxford, but he was bullied and bored there, and he had engineered his own expulsion. Then he joined the Bombay Native Infantry and moved to India, where he learned 12 languages in 7 years. What Burton didn't have was a title or money or even a religious affiliation. On the contrary, he was openly, emphatically agnostic, studying every religion and respecting none. He was that most alarming of figures to Victorian Britons, a hedonistic man in a puritanical age. He enthusiastically tried every hallucinogen he came across. He allowed and even encouraged wild stories of sexual exploits and even murder to circulate around him unchecked. And he translated into English works of literature, from the Arabian Nights to the Kama Sutra, that scandalized and secretly thrilled his fellow countrymen. Burton also had the fatal flaw of not looking particularly British in the eyes of his countrymen. He had his English-Irish father's black hair and piercing black eyes that he was said to use to hypnotize women. And he had an absolutely unforgettable face. None other than Bram Stoker, who would go on to write Dracula, was obsessed with him. "The man riveted my attention," Stoker wrote after meeting Burton. "He was dark and forceful and masterful and ruthless. I never saw anyone like him. He is steel. He would go through you like a sword. He was especially fascinated with Burton's teeth, writing that when Burton talked, his canine tooth showed its full length like the gleam of a dagger, a description that may have inspired literature's most iconic vampire. Burton's second in command was a man who was as unremarkable as Burton was extraordinary, his complete opposite in nearly every way. John Hanning Speke was everything Britons expected their heroes to be. He was blonde and blue-eyed, born into the aristocracy, an officer in the British Army. He was puritanical and prim, priding himself on his discipline and judging others harshly if, in his eyes, they fell short. While Burton buried himself in books, Speke devoted himself to hunting, planning to open a natural history museum in his ancestral home. Speke was also deeply, dangerously resentful of his commander, a festering bitterness that remained unspoken for years, building with each offense Burton unknowingly gave, each achievement or accolade that Burton received and Speke did not. For years, Speke simmered with barely contained anger and envy, until finally it boiled over, leaving Burton shocked and bewildered, and in the end, destroying them both. Burton had not chosen Speke as his second in command because he admired him or even because he liked him, but because he felt he owed him. The two men had met a year earlier in Aden as Burton was about to embark on his first search for the source of the Nile. Just before the expedition was about to leave for Somaliland, Burton had learned that one member of his expedition, a close friend and valued companion, had died suddenly. Speke happened to be in Aden at the same time on a hunting trip, and he asked Burton if he could join his expedition. Burton had known that he was taking a risk. He worried that Speke could not speak Arabic or any African languages, and that he seemed to have little knowledge or interest in the people whose land they would be traveling through. But despite his reservations, he had taken pity on Speke, allowing him to join his expedition. I saw that he was going to lose his money and his life, Burton would later write of Speke, marveling at his own disastrous decision. Why should I have cared? I do not know. That first expedition, however, had ended even before it began. Soon after arriving in Somaliland, their camp had been attacked in the middle of the night. By morning, one member of the expedition was dead. Speke was barely alive after being stabbed 11 times. And Burton had a javelin thrust through his jaw, impaling him from cheek to cheek, and leaving him with a long, jagged scar down the side of his face, only adding to his reputation as a strange and dangerous man. This shared tragedy had made it impossible for Burton to choose another man for his next expedition. When Burton and Speke returned to East Africa in 1856 with the newly formed East African expedition, they began this time in Zanzibar. 20 miles off the coast of modern-day Tanzania, the island had been occupied for at least 17,000 years before the first European, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama, had landed there more than 350 years earlier. Da Gama had immediately realized what Africans and Arabs had long known. With a harbor that was both protected and easily defended, Zanzibar was the perfect launching pad for trade and exploration. It was also one of the most active slave markets in the world. Thousands of people were brought to Zanzibar in chains every year, sold for 4 to 5 pounds for a man, slightly more for a woman. Burton and Speke, like most of their contemporaries, were unapologetic in their racism, with all of its attendant arrogance and ignorance. But they were sickened by the slave trade, which, Burton wrote, had made the island an admirable training ground for damnation. No one knew this shameful and painful history more intimately than the man who was about to become the most important member of Burton's expedition, and arguably the most accomplished guide in the history of African exploration, Sidi Mubarak Bombay. Kidnapped from his village in East Africa when he was just a child, Bombay had been sold for cloth in Zanzibar, and then forced onto a ship traveling to India, where he had been enslaved for some 20 years. Finally freed when the man who owned him died, he had made his way back to the continent of his birth, where he met Burton and Speke. Bombay quickly became the heart and, in many ways, the hero of Burton's expedition. For Speke, Bombay was his porter and his translator, but really his only friend. Bombay spoke Hindi as well as Swahili and Arabic, and he could understand the Anglo-Hindi that Speke had picked up in India. Before they met Bombay, Burton had been the only person Speke could talk to, leaving him feeling completely isolated from everyone else in the expedition, and even more resentful of Burton, who was daily having animated conversations in Arabic and Swahili with the other men. The more resentful Speke became of Burton, the more heavily he relied on Bombay. But Bombay was important not just to Speke, but to Burton and to the expedition as a whole. He was the linchpin that kept them connected. The caravan leader, porter, mediator, translator, nurse. Even after losing everything he knew and loved and being enslaved for decades, Bombay somehow emerged from this staggering tragedy, not with bitterness, but with kindness. He was soft-hearted, patient, hardworking, generous to a fault. He would also go on to achieve what Burton and Speke would never be able to do, even with all their resources, advantages, and ambition. Arguably, Bombay would do more to help map East Africa than any European explorer ever to enter his homeland. Not only did he travel with Burton and Speke to Lake Tanganyika, which Burton hoped was the source of the Nile, but he was with Speke when, in a brutal twist of fate, he, and not Burton, became the first European to see the Nyanza, the largest lake in Africa and the actual source of the White Nile, which Speke would name for his own queen, Victoria. Then, a year later, Bombay returned to the Nyanza with Speke and James Grant. And then he helped Henry Morton Stanley find David Livingstone. You know Dr. Livingstone, I presume?
Yeah.
That was Bombay.
Yeah.
And then, with Bernie Levitt Cameron, he became the first to cross the entire continent from east to west, sea to sea. The last person I have to mention was central to Burton's life, but not to the search for the source of the White Nile, or to any major expedition, but not because she didn't want to be, or because she didn't have the strength, intelligence, or determination required for such a difficult undertaking. She was a part of the expedition because she wasn't welcome, because she was a woman living in the 19th century. Isabel Arundel had been raised by a controlling mother in a strict, fervently religious, aristocratic family. She was related to Sir Thomas Arundel, who was a cousin of both Henry VIII and the two wives he beheaded, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. But she dreamed of a very different kind of life, one of freedom and adventure. I long to rush around the world in an express, she wrote. I feel as if I shall go mad if I remain at home. What others dare, I can dare. And why should I not? Why should we not have some useful, active life? Why, with spirit, brains, and energies, are women to exist upon worsted work and household accounts? It makes me sick, and I will not do it. In short, Isabel dreamed of being a man. Specifically, she dreamed of being Richard Burton. I wish I were a man, she wrote. If I were, I would be Richard Burton. But as I'm a woman, I would be Richard Burton's wife. A decade younger than Burton, almost to the day, Isabel waited 9 years to marry him. She sat at home fearing for his life while he went to Mecca, to Aden, Somaliland, to the Crimean War, and then back to East Africa in search of a source. By the time Burton finally came home to marry Isabel, she was 29 years old, a spinster in Victorian England. But she had spent those years not just waiting to be his wife, but preparing for it. She read everything he wrote. She learned how to ride a horse and to edit his manuscripts, a job that he required of her. And she even learned how to fence, fervently hoping that one day she would be called upon to save her husband's life. Isabel was and would always be passionately, even obsessively devoted to Burton, building her life around him, abandoning her own dreams to fulfill his. I'm glad to say there was only one will in the house, and it was his, she would write. I was only too lucky to have met my master. In the end, however, Isabel would decide that the greatest duty to her husband was not to defend his life, but to save his soul. Tragically, she believed that the only way to do that was to destroy his work. Isabel's story, like that of Burton's and Speke's, is a cautionary tale. Beware obsession in all its many dangerous forms. In fact, danger is a recurring theme in this book. The danger of crossing more than 1,000 miles of unmapped land, of enduring fatal diseases, slow starvation, and sudden attack. The danger of obsession and envy, of being blinded by an ambition and a hatred so deeply rooted that it destroys both its target and its bearer. But most of all, this is a story of the danger of arrogance, of believing that you can discover a land that had been inhabited by millions of people for thousands of years before London or Paris, that you understand a continent better than the people who live there, and that you can somehow improve their lives by seizing their land and their resources, appropriating their history and their culture. If we can learn anything from the past, from humankind's greatest achievements and most devastating mistakes, from our most revered heroes and despised villains, it is that arrogance and ignorance always go together, hand in hand. And the only way to free ourselves from their terrible legacy is to keep a clear and steady eye on our history and to use that knowledge again and again to correct our course. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take questions. Yes.
You had a picture of Bombay. Where did that come from?
That's from the Royal Geographical Society. So there are, I believe, 3 existing pictures of him. There's that one. There's another that I also use in the book. That's just a headshot. And then there's one with him and a group of other men. And that one, I believe, was taken by James Grant, who was Speke's second in command when he ends up going back to Africa. I believe it was taken in 1860, and yeah, they have it at the Royal Geographical.
Just to ask, it sounds like you did a significant amount of repetition. Like, was that respected during this time, or is it only now looking back?
Yeah, it's mostly only now. So at the time, as you might imagine, it's one of these things that we see repeated again and again throughout history and in many walks of life, where the people who are actually there, the explorers who actually went to Africa, they relied heavily, obviously, on the people who lived there and people like Bombay. But the people at home, these armchair geographers, had very little respect for that information, and so they would say, of course we can't trust it if it comes from someone who actually lives there, and so the explorers would get that information and sort of, not attribute it to anyone, just sort of give it themselves. And so Bombay, he did receive a medal for his work in many different expeditions. He did receive a stipend, but he never was invited to England to receive it in person. And he's been forgotten. I worked at National Geographic magazine for 6 years. And in that time, as you might imagine, I was steeped in stories of exploration, stories about Africa, and I was very interested in the story about Burton and Speke that I'd heard. In that entire time, I had never heard the name Sidi Mubarak Bombay, never. And it wasn't until I started to do my own research on them that I realized, and I kept seeing him again and again and again in all these explorers' accounts of their journeys. And I realized what a tremendous effect he had on the mapping of this part of the world.
There's time to read time to read bookstore still open in Kansas City.
Which bookstore in Kansas?
Time to read.
Oh, Time to Read, no, there's a.
I thought so. It's just like World News. They closed it up.
Yeah, but Rainy Day Books is still there, it's been there for.
No, I was back. This is back in the 70s.
Oh.
Well, 79. Yeah. So they closed too.
Yeah, as far as I
Yeah,
know.
like World News too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but Rainy Day Books is.
Them type of book, yeah. Right.
Yeah, fantastic, yeah.
Where was Bombay's ancestral homeland, or where was he taken from originally? Was it enslaved?
It was right there in East Africa, it was a few hundred miles from the coast, and he was Yao. That was his people.
What was
And what happened to him, and I will say, both Burton and Speke were obviously deeply flawed in different ways. But Speke took the time to really ask Bombay about himself because he relied on him so heavily and really came to care about him, although it was sort of an abusive relationship. But he did at least ask him about himself and what happened to him. And what happened is, what they would do is these slavers would come in to the interior from the coast, and they would tempt these people in these villages who were more naive with beads and things that they wanted without making them pay. And then one day they would just show up out of the blue and say, "You need to pay us right now." And often these people had very little anyway; they couldn't pay them back, and they would come with guns and they would come with machetes and things. And so usually the people would just run. And that's what happened with Bombay. His mother had died when he was an infant, but he was about 12 years old, and he never saw his father again after that day. So he doesn't know if he escaped or if he was killed. He doesn't know what happened to him. And he was put in chains and dragged to the coast, taken to Kilwa, a little island, and then farther north to Zanzibar. Yes.
How long does it take you to research, or what's the process of writing a book like that?
So usually it takes me 5 years. It was 5 years for this book. And so I did a lot of research, obviously in the UK, archival research at the Royal Geographical Society, the British Library. I was in Edinburgh at the National Library of Scotland. And this story also, it builds to this really shocking, tragic event. And that took place just outside of Bath, and I was able to go there as well. But then obviously the main trip that I took a lot of time to plan was going to East Africa. And I'd been in Ethiopia when I was at National Geographic and loved it. And so I was really looking forward to going back, but I have 3 children and it's a complicated trip. And so it took me a while to plan it. And finally, I come up with a date and it's February of 2020. And I didn't, at that time, there wasn't that much going on COVID in the United States yet. I thought it would be fine. And it turned out it was, but I really just cut it super close. I got home March 8th or 9th. And so I just sort of made it before they closed the door. But it was an incredible trip. So I was in and out of Kenya, but then I went to Zanzibar, which if you've never been and you ever have the opportunity, it's the most exquisite place. It's every single color, every smell, every sound you can imagine. It's just fascinating and full of history. And then I went onto mainland Tanzania and went west to Lake Tanganyika, which I said was what Burton thought. So you saw that slug map. So they thought, okay, there's going to be one enormous inland lake, but it turns out there are 3 enormous inland lakes. So there's Tanganyika, there's a Nyanza, and a Nyasa. And so the Tanganyika is just huge, but it's kind of sort of narrow and long. But when you're on it, you feel like you're on an ocean. It's so big. And when I was there, I had to go from one part of the coast to another. And I was waiting for this boat, and there was a big storm, and it just was getting later and later. And my husband was with me. And so by the time the boat comes, it's dark, and it's not, I mean, it's just a small, open, wooden boat. And again, you're like, we were like on a storm-tossed sea. You know, the waves were just huge, and we were, I'll never forget, we were just like tipping all the way this way, all the way that way, and I was just terrified. And I remember saying to my husband, you know, look how far the other coast, I mean, it's a several-hour trip, look how far it is, there's no way, if we capsize, there's no way we'll be able to make it over there. And he said, don't worry about it, the crocodiles will eat us before we get there. It's full of crocodiles, this lake. So anyway, we survived, and we went then back east again and north to the Nyanza. And the Nyanza, as I said, is the largest lake in Africa. It's the second largest freshwater lake in the world. It has an area of, I think, some 26,000 square miles. It's just so mind-bendingly huge. And so I was in the southern part of it, which is what Speke first saw, and just believed that what it was the source of the White Nile was really just dumb luck. You know, he was only there for a couple of days, and he hadn't circumnavigated the whole thing. And it's up in the northern reaches that then pours out of the Nile. The Nile goes from there. Yes.
Why didn't they try to ascend the Nile from the Mediterranean? What were those kind of theories?
Right, so they did for many, many years, for thousands of years, 2,000 years. They tried coming from the Mediterranean, but what stopped them was something called the Sud. It's just an enormous swamp. It's enormous, and they just would stop every time. No one could get past that. And so, and it wasn't until then in the 1850s that they realized, okay, we need to try it a different way, and they decided that they would go inland from the East Coast. Instead, yeah, you're just never going to be able to do it. Trying to ascend them. Yeah.
When you tell these stories that are incredibly intriguing, have these people's lives that are rich and complex, as you go through to research it, how do you keep from going down rabbit holes or getting lost in these worlds? And I guess that's your talent, being able to condense into this 300-page book. But you just have like this voluminous catalog of research you've done that can lead to other stories at a time.
Right. So I do. I mean, usually they don't, or at least it hasn't worked that way for me. I haven't taken a part of one of my books and end up writing another book about it, because I usually feel like I've kind of said what I wanted to say about those different things. But yes, there are many, many rabbit holes. And that's one of the luxuries of having that time, because you don't know what is going to be useful. You really don't. So I usually take 2 years roughly to do the research, just going everywhere, just casting a very wide net, getting all the information that I can. And then it's another year or so just trying to organize it all. Because with this kind of narrative nonfiction, in order to have dialogue, in order to have all those details that you hope will make it a really immersive experience, really make the reader feel like they're there, you have to have so much primary source material that you just feel like you're drowning in it. Letters and diaries, newspaper articles. So it takes a long time just to organize it all. And then I outline this. And when I talk to like high school students, and I tell them, you have to outline it. They don't like to hear that, but it really does make a really big difference with this kind of writing, especially because then you can do things like foreshadowing and things like that. You can kind of set things up and figure out how you're going to structure the story before you start to write it. But I'll tell a quick story about sort of finding something that you didn't expect to find when you're doing research. I wrote a book about James Garfield, about the assassination of James Garfield, and he was just this extraordinary individual, incredibly brilliant, kind, brave, unbelievably progressive for his time, and has been completely forgotten because he was killed just a few months into his first term. And so I was at the Library of Congress in the presidential papers doing research on him, and it's James Garfield, so hardly anyone's looked at these papers since 1881. And so but there's a lot there. And at the Library of Congress, they have all these rules as they should. And so you can have one cart at a time. You can have, I think it's like 5 bins on that cart, 1 bin on your table at a time, and 1 folder for that bin on the tables. And they watch you like a hawk. So I'm, following all the rules, and I open this folder, and inside is an envelope, and I don't know what's in the envelope, and the front of the envelope is facing the table. So I open it, and all of this hair falls out, and there's hair all over the desk. And I turn it over, and handwritten on it is clipped from President Garfield's head on his deathbed. And I was like, oh crap, and I'm desperately trying to blow it back into the thing, thinking my career's over, they're gonna throw me out of here. But I also realized when I looked at that hair, I mean, it was amazing. It looked like you could have clipped it from your child's head yesterday. And I thought, here this man is, he was 49 years old. He had so much promise for our young country, and it was this unbelievable tragedy. And it was just this really powerful reminder of the responsibility that you have when you're trying to tell someone else's story, of doing all that you can to try to get it right. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I hadn't thought about the Burtons for a long time, but as I remember, you can tell me this is right, didn't Isabel destroy a lot of his work at the end in order, because she thought it was pornographic and she didn't want that out there?
Exactly right. Like I said, she was extremely religious, and so sort of the twin obsessions of her life were Richard Burton, her husband, and her faith. And she was always very, very conflicted. And he found it very amusing at the end of his life because, as I said, it built up to this sort of tragic event, and Speke dies in a way that, if you read the book, you will find out. But and Burton is sort of, for the rest of his life, he's kind of dismissed and ignored, and he's penniless, and he's angry, but what he has, sort of when everything else is stripped away, what he still has is the essence of who he is, which is a scholar. And he has always loved to learn, loved learning languages and cultures, and his writing and other people's writing. And so he starts working on all these translations, and he finds it really amusing that they're like selling like hotcakes. Everybody is outraged about all these obscenity laws at the time, but he makes more money from those translations than he ever did from anything else he did in his life. But Isabel is horrified, but there's really nothing she can do. But near the end of his life, he's sort of sick, and she's thrilled to kind of have him to herself. And he is working on this translation of the Scented Garden. And he tells her one night, he's like, look, I'm almost finished. I'm going to finish it tomorrow. And when I do, this is my greatest work. This is my magnum opus. And it meant so much to him, and he was so proud of it. But he said, it's also my gift to you. This is what is going to, you can sell it, and that's what's going to ease your later life. And he dies that night, just because he almost finished it. And she's, as you might imagine, completely devastated. And so she insists on this big Catholic funeral for her agnostic husband. And afterwards, she goes back to their house, and she goes into her room, and she locks the door, and there's a roaring fire, and she takes his papers, and she thinks about it, and she thinks of what he told her, and she thinks about, how proud he was of this translation in particular, how much it meant to him. But then she thinks, of the money that she could have, and how it would help her, because they really didn't have much. But then she thinks, what matters more? Sort of what he would want in his earthly life, or what he will need in his heavenly life. And so she takes it page by page, and she feeds it to the flames. And she says, it's interesting because she says, if he knew what I was doing, would he curse me or bless me? She said, the question will haunt me to my death. Yeah.
What led you to choose this as a subject?
So as I said, I was working at National Geographic for 6 years. That was 20 years ago. And I was just fascinated with the story of these two men who were so very different, and the story of their friendship and the betrayal of that friendship. And it had stayed with me all those years, and I finished my book about Winston Churchill, and I spent an entire year trying to make a book about Marie Curie work. And I was really fascinated with her. I mean, her, obviously, the discovery of radium, but also her personal life is incredibly powerful and poignant. But I couldn't make it work because all of the action takes place in her mind. She used to have two dresses, a black and a dark blue, that she could wear in the lab and she could wear, when she was accepting the Nobel Prize. And so it was sort of like, well, she's still there in her black dress in the lab. So with this kind of writing, you really need action, to make things work. And so I was having lunch with my husband, and I was saying, I was trying to think of other ideas, and he said, you've literally been talking about Burton and Speke for 20 years, so maybe this is the time. So as I said, I didn't want to write about two European explorers, quote unquote, discovering something in Africa, but I was just doing some research, and I read about Sidi Mubarak Bombay, and then I read about it again and again, thing after thing, and I thought, this is the story I want to try to tell. Yeah.
What are some possibilities for your next books?
The pressure. I actually do have another idea. I just finished a proposal last night, and I sent it to my agent, and she's really excited about it. I'm super excited about it, and I can't say what it is because my editor hasn't seen it yet. But I will say that it's about a woman, and as I said, I've been trying to write about a woman for a long time, but for me, the challenge has been that women have done extraordinary things throughout history, but other people weren't writing about them. And so, for instance, when I wrote about Winston Churchill, he was only 24, 25 years old at that time of the Boer War, but he came from a famous family. But more than that, he was this extraordinarily arrogant, strange, smart guy who was taking these crazy chances to get noticed, right? And so other people were watching. And it's funny, even at that age, again and again, I would read in letters and diaries people saying, I can't stand that Winston Churchill. He's going to be prime minister one day, but he's so annoying. But they were paying attention to him, right? And they were writing about him, and really vividly. And so I had so much to work with, even though he was such a young man at that time. But I think I finally found something that's going to work, and I'm really excited about it. Thank you. Wish me luck. Yeah.
To follow up on those questions about what takes you to your stories, the Garfield story seems a lot less exotic and a person apart from your other work. How did you get into that?
So, like most Americans, I didn't know anything about Garfield except that he had been assassinated. And it's not that I was interested in writing about another president. My first book had been about Theodore Roosevelt. I wanted another story that had a lot of science in it, because my first book is set in the Amazon, and I was able to talk about evolution and natural history. So I was actually researching Alexander Graham Bell. And, he was a very young man at that time. He had invented the telephone just 5 years earlier. He was famous. He had a little bit of money for the first time. He had all these ideas, all these things he wanted to do. And when Garfield was shot, he dropped everything. He turned his life upside down to try to save him. And I thought, I wonder what Garfield was like. And I start researching him, and I'm like, oh my God. So for those of you who don't know, he was born incredibly poor. He was our last president born in a log cabin. His father died before he was 2. He didn't have shoes until he was 4 in Ohio. And so to send him, but his mother and his older brother knew that he was really uniquely special. And so they saved a little bit of money to try to help him go to college. So his first year in college, he was a janitor and a carpenter to help pay his tuition. By his second year, while he's still a sophomore in college, they made him a professor of literature, mathematics, and ancient languages. He was an incredible classicist. He knew the entire Aeneid by heart in Latin. When he was in Congress, he wrote an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem. He hid a runaway slave. He was a hero in the Union Army in the Civil War. He was instrumental in bringing about black suffrage. He never wanted to be president. It was just this crazy thing that happened at the Republican convention that nobody could make up. He was just this really extraordinary individual, and I genuinely think would have been one of our great presidents had he not been killed by his doctors. So as soon as I realized all of that, I thought, but it was funny because, my first book, is about Theodore Roosevelt in the Amazon and this unmapped river and 3 men die, and then I come to my editor with this proposal for a book about James Garfield, and it's like, okay, but I give him credit. He said, go ahead and give it a try, and it's really one of the books that I'm most proud of and was honored to have been able to tell that story. I'm sorry.
You've written now 2 books about horrific river trips. If you had to pick one that you would have had to have taken, which one would you have picked?
I would go with Roosevelt and the Amazon. I would not go on this trip at all. If you read this book, you will see why. These men were so sick all the time. So this central expedition, there's several expeditions, but the central expedition took almost 2 years. And both men at certain times were blind for months. They had these horrible eye infections. Burton had such severe malaria, he was paralyzed, could not walk at all for almost a year. He couldn't even use his hands. And in Speke, I'll tell you, you want to hear what happens in Speke? One night, he's in his tent, and there's a storm, and it knocks down his tent. And so to put his tent back up, he lights a candle. Well, the flame attracts this horde of beetles. So his tent is totally full of hundreds of beetles, and he's flailing away at them desperately, and he just can't get rid of them, and he's finally just exhausted. So he lies down to sleep, and pretty soon he feels a beetle in his ear, and it's burrowing deeper and deeper. It's sort of angry because it can't get out. It's burrowing deeper and deeper. So he's desperate. He's trying everything. He pours salt in there, butter, oil. He can't get rid of it. So finally, out of desperation, he takes a penknife and he jabs it in his ear, and he kills the beetle, but he deafens himself in that ear for the rest of his life. And he also has a string of boils and down his vein. He can't eat for weeks. And for the next few weeks, little bits of the beetle start coming out in his earwax, like a wing or a leg or something. So yeah, I would not go on this trip.
Do you read your own audiobooks?
I do listen to them sometimes. Have you listened to this one?
No, I was curious to know, were you the?
Oh, do I actually do the reading? I'm sorry. No, I don't. I would be terrible at it. So an actor named Paul Michael, he read the first 2 of my books and this one. And then I chose, he's American, he does amazing accents and things, but I did choose a British actor named Simon Vance, who's really also extraordinary, to read the Churchill book. But they're unbelievable. And I usually don't listen to the whole thing, because I'm always thinking of ways I should have edited it, changed it. But it's amazing. And they really, really bring them to life. And I think it really matters, who reads these books, because I listen to books a lot too if I'm driving, and if I don't even if I like the book, if I don't like the person reading, it's just so annoying, right? Have you heard of the book Sixth Extinction by Betsy Colbert? Anyway, it's a really fascinating book, and I know her through my husband. He was a foreign correspondent in the New York Times, and she used to work in the New York Times. And she's kind of scrappy and sort of tomboyish, really cool. And she wrote that book in the first person. And so she reads, I think, the introduction, but then somebody else reads the rest of the book, and I thought, I'll listen to it. But it's this completely wrong voice, this sort of light, feathery, kind of girly voice is completely wrong, I thought, for the book. So yeah, it does.
One more question.
Sure.
Do they actually audition for this?
for you?
Well, you know, I've been really lucky in that, they'll send me clips. I don't know anything about that world, but they will send me like, okay, here are 4 or 5 different names, and here are some clips of readings, and I get to listen to them and say, yeah, I like this person better, you know, or, so they do give me some say in it, yeah.
I saw the movie River of Doubt that was made into a documentary movie on PBS.
Right.
To what extent were you involved in that?
So, yeah, PBS did do, they did do Destiny of the Republic first, and I was very involved in that. And then when they started on the River of Doubt, I was sort of in the end days of Hero of the Empire, my book about Churchill. And as I said, I had 3 kids and I just didn't have time to be involved in it. But I gave them everything. I gave them all of my notes. I gave them all of my contacts and things like that. So I was involved more behind the scenes.
Are there any discussions around feature film, limited series?
Right, so Destiny of the Republic is being adapted for a Netflix series, and we'll see what happens. My younger sister is a screenwriter, so I know that many times things sort of go pretty far down the road and then nothing happens. So I'm not getting my hopes up. But the nice thing about it, I remember there's this one writer I knew who I really respected, and his works had been adapted into films, and one of his books was adapted to a film that wasn't that good, and somebody said, oh, are you upset that this has happened to your book? And he's like, good, and there's my book. My book's right there. It's fine. It's exactly, as I wrote it. Nothing happened to my book. So it's fun, I don't know anything about Hollywood, so every year or 2 I'll get an update on it. These things go on for years sometimes, at least in my experience. So yeah,
I'm just curious, is that with Netflix or with the production company that then sold it?
So the way it happened with me, years ago, I got a letter from this young man who is a screenwriter. He's done a lot of really cool things. He wrote Bad Education with Hugh Jackman, if any of you saw that, and several other things. And was just really passionate about adapting the book and in a kind of interesting, creative, modern way that I would have never thought of. And so I said, sure, give it a chance. And my agent in LA, she wrote a contract, and it just lasted a year. So basically you have a year to see what you can do with it. At the end of that year, if we both agree, then we'll give it another year. And he was able to sell it to Netflix. And so, so he's written I think it's 6 episodes. He's written them all, and he's done a really great job. And so now they're, looking at casting and things. So we'll see. Well, thank you so much.